President Biden spent the last several days meeting with European allies and shoring up support for NATO. Before he headed home, he delivered what the White House was billing as a major address in Poland. He sent a sharp warning to Russia about its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and emphasized that NATO needs to maintain a united front as the war grinds on. The president said the U.S. is seeking to avoid direct confrontation with Russia. However, he warned Russian leader Vladimir Putin not to touch, quote, one single inch of NATO territory, meaning the U.S. will take action to defend its NATO allies. The president also cautioned that the war in Ukraine will not be over anytime soon.
In this battle, we need to be clear-eyed. This battle will not be won in days or months either. We need to steel ourselves for the long fight ahead.
For more, I'd like to bring in former Undersecretary of State and former Ambassador to Russia and the United Nations, Thomas Pickering. He's also a member of the Foreign Affairs Policy Board for the U.S. State Department. Ambassador Pickering, what do you think are some of the biggest highlights from this address?
I think that the president wrapped up his visit in Europe with two or three important points that should stick with us for a long time. One of those is the absolute necessity for continued unity. The requirement for persistence rather than fleeing into a reactionary mode for each thing that comes along. A sense that he was not crowing about the successes so far, so much as preparing his European listeners and his Ukrainian listeners in particular for their long struggle which lies ahead. And a deep sense of the commitment which he wrapped up from all of the various statements that he has made, receiving 100,000 refugees, keeping on with military supply to Ukraine. And we hope that that will be, in fact, added to rather than merely represent a static commitment. And the notion that he worked very hard with President Putin at the early days of this particular confrontation to seek to find a diplomatic solution, which undoubtedly will have to come if no particular side here, and it doesn't look as if that's the case, offers the other side some kind of surrender. The Russians pulling back at this stage is not something he spent a lot of time on, perhaps because he and others have learned to distrust Russian information and information warfare as based on mistruths, half-truths, and misleading statements rather than necessarily what they intended to do. And so it's very, very important at this stage, I think, coming out of the president's speech, to trust but verify, listen, but do not in one way or another get gulled into early decisions made on hopeful ideas.
And Ambassador, do you think that after this visit that there's a chance things will move toward a diplomatic resolution with Russia?
Well, there is a diplomatic discussion going on between Ukraine and Russia, not having much progress. That will be the bellwether. We should look at that very carefully. Whether that expands and includes other countries with respect to broader issues is very much an open book question at the present time. I don't think it will move rapidly in that direction. And I don't know that it will move rapidly in the direction of some workout between Russia and Ukraine. Russia's focused on the Donbass, but Russia gives nothing back to President Zelensky in terms of either the Crimea or the two so-called independent republics of the Donbass, which he wants President Zelensky to recognize. President Zelensky is held firm. He's not giving up sovereignty, territory, or independence anywhere.
So do you see Russia wavering at all on any of its key demands? And if not, what will it take to resolve this situation?
I've seen small gives at various times on the Russian effort to try to create for itself a win of some kind on 6 or 8 various points. But they might just be hiccups in reporting as much as they are any real Russian move at this stage. And so my advice to everybody is watch carefully, wait patiently, make your decision on the basis of actions rather than words, and then let's see where we go from there.
And are you hearing anything about how Ukraine is responding to the president's visit, and were they able to get what they wanted from the president in this visit?
They did not get everything they wanted. President Zelensky still has his hopes, or at least his request, pitched around a no-fly zone, which raises serious possibilities of a Russia-NATO conflict, which the president hopes to avoid, given the potential for that perhaps to slide into or back into, by accident or miscalculation, nuclear use. The president is prepared to continue upping the ante, I feel sure, on sanctions to the degree that he can, and he's recognized that oil sanctions are perhaps some of his most powerful weapons, along with the ability to assure that Russia does not make use financially of the $600+ billion that Russia has amassed as part of its foreign exchange reserves. Those are important. We need to be careful as we go down this road not to allow oil shortages in Europe either to drive the Europeans apart from us on the one hand, or drive the price up so that, in fact, Putin reaps a financial reward for his aggressive invasion of Ukraine.
And the war in Ukraine is creating a massive humanitarian crisis in Eastern Europe. And as you know, once this situation does eventually end, that does not just go away. So what kind of help will Ukraine need to get back on their feet? And is this an undertaking that NATO allies are willing to do?
It's not clear yet whether that's the case. We want to watch that carefully. But the expenses will be horrendous. One only has to look at the daily pictures of the destruction of physical infrastructure in Ukraine, as well as the masses of Ukrainians displaced, including a huge volume of children. And there is much to be done. I certainly hope that my country, which has remained endlessly generous on all of these kinds of tragedies, will in fact do its leading part to help rebuild. And I hope we get to the process of rebuilding as soon as possible and stop this obviously reckless and mindless destruction in Ukraine in the absence of having any capability among Russian military, either tactically or strategically, to make any real progress.
How do you think this address has been received or will be received by the Ukrainian people as well as Russia?
I hope it will be well received. If there are things that the Ukrainians hope to hear that they didn't hear, one can certainly find things in the address that they should have heard, which are further solidifying our support for them and their struggle, and recognizing that they bear the brunt of the human and indeed physical losses that are involved in defending their homeland. We could ask for nothing more from Ukrainians. Ukrainians will certainly continue to ask a great deal, both from us and from our NATO allies. And that match is one that we should seek in every way to provide realistically, honestly, straightforwardly, and generously.
He spoke directly to the Russian people at the end there. Do you think that's going to have an impact?
I think that from my experience in Russia, some Russians will certainly be affected by the notion, and there are figures on the number who have left, mainly, I think, among the intellectual elite in Russia, who are in one way clearly negatively, deeply affected by what Putin has done, with no provocation, with no indication of any reason why he should have launched a military aggression against Ukraine. But large numbers of Russians are also prisoners of an information system in that country, advocates and adherents of television watching, which now in one way or another is feeding them the Putin line rather than the truth. And the struggle over the truth is just one of the many elements of a struggle now going on, particularly in the information area, that we obviously need to do everything we can to improve and pick up our game. Not that it hasn't been there, but the challenge is great.
Ambassador Pickering, thank you for your insight.